So we now understand, I guess, the course of the war, how it was fought, how it was won by the Allies, how it was lost by Germany and Austria. What was the peace like? What was exactly the terms of the peace? Often the peace settlement is known as the Treaty of Versailles, the Versailles Settlement. The Versailles Settlement was actually specifically with Germany. So each one of the defeated Central Powers, primarily Germany, Austria, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire, had pieces dictated to them in Paris. So the Treaty of Versailles was actually specifically the peace that was dictated to the Germans. There was actually different treaties that were assigned to the other defeated or Central Powers. So they all come under the umbrella of the Paris Peace Settlement. So the four major powers, the four victorious powers at Versailles, at least the four largest victorious powers, were the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and Italy. So they came to Paris in early 1919 to negotiate a peace. Interestingly, the very day that negotiations began, firstly, the negotiations with Germany took place at Versailles. Versailles, obviously, as we've seen, was the famous home of the French monarchy for a long time. But it also had been the place that the German Empire was declared in 1871. And actually, the Allies began the kind of peace talks on the same day as the anniversary that marked the proclamation of the German Empire in January 1871. So in some ways, especially in French eyes, this was very much about finishing unfinished business dating back to the Franco-Prussian War, and the Allies kind of in some ways participated in the symbolism of that by picking the location and date in which the negotiations began. All four powers had kind of different objectives in what they wanted. Italy had been promised various territorial concessions by the French and British in 1915. They expected those to be realised. The French, probably in particular, were the ones who wanted the most severe punishment inflicted upon the Germans. I mean, France suffered enormously during the First World War. 1 in 10 adult males in France were killed during the First World War. Most of the war in the Western Front had been fought on French territories. The Germans had stripped the industrial value out of many of the French areas they had captured. So the French wanted the Germans to pay the price of the war and make them pay. The British didn't suffer the same physical damage to the economy that the French had suffered, but obviously had lost hundreds of thousands of men in the conflict as well, and had similarly punitive kind of aspirations for the Germans. In 1918, there was an election in the United Kingdom right after the war finished, and a popular slogan being used by various candidates was "Squeeze the Germans until the pips squeak." That we want to impose a harsh peace upon the Germans. The United States, led by President Woodrow Wilson, had a slightly different opinion. Woodrow Wilson was much more of a political philosopher. He believed that it was important not to have a peace that was too punitive on the Germans because this might set the stage for further instability down the line. And obviously, as we know in hindsight, he was completely correct on that. He had issued a series of what were called 14 points in 1918, in which he said there might be peace for bases in Europe, which wouldn't have involved a complete German surrender. And so that was his kind of main platform. That was his model for what peace would look like. So the 14 points, I won't go through all of them, but it included things like guaranteeing the freedom of the seas, guaranteeing the creation of an independent Poland, guaranteeing that the territories the Germans had occupied after the Russians withdrew from the war were removed, ending secret treaties between powers, and also trying to guarantee that all nations would be allowed to make their own minds up about forming their own nations. So Woodrow was the most idealistic of the various leaders, and in some ways his kind of willingness to cut the Germans something of a break clashed with the ambitions of the British and the French. Georges Clemenceau was the French Prime Minister, and he had a very kind of harsh comment for Wilson. He once said, "I'm tired of Wilson and his 14 points. God himself had only 10, which kind of tells you all you need to know about the French attitude towards the idealism of Woodrow Wilson. It's worth bearing in mind that this was not really a peace negotiation in any kind of formal sense. Essentially, the Germans were dictated to, that the Allies decided amongst themselves what the peace would be, and then the Germans were told to accept it or else. So some of the concessions that were made, not surprisingly, Alsace-Lorraine, the provinces that the Germans had taken in 1870 from France, 1871, were returned to France. The French were also allowed to occupy the Saar region, which was a rich industrial region in western Germany. The French would occupy that and work its mines for the next 15 years. And then eventually a referendum would be held on whether the Tsar wanted to return to Germany or remain as part of France. The French hoped actually that the Saarland would elect to join France, but actually when the election was held in 1935, most of the Tsars who identified as German voted to be returned to Germany. The French also occupied the Rhineland in Western Germany as a way of guaranteeing that if war broke out with Germany again, the French could strike directly into the middle of Germany and in some ways ensure that if a war broke out between France and Germany again, the war would this time be fought in Germany as opposed to being fought in France. Germany had to pay for the cost of the war. The cost of the war was added up. It was calculated coming to 132 billion gold marks, which was an staggering price. And the Germans were expected to pay this back. 52% of the payment would go to France. The rest would be paid to the other various allies. And long story short, the war indemnity, the cost of the war was simply too great for the German economy to bear. And as we will see, probably played a significant role in the rise of Adolf Hitler. The one thing that should be noted that before we get too sympathetic for the Germans was they imposed a pretty harsh war indemnity on the French in 1871. They certainly had taken full advantage of the Soviets' desire to withdraw from the war in 1917 and impose a pretty punitive peace on them. And had plans themselves to pretty much do the exact same thing to the Allies if they were victorious in the war, to impose a heavy bill or heavy financial settlement upon them as well. That's not to say the Allies were right in doing what they did or wrong, but just to bear in mind that the Germans had done similar things before and were planning on doing the same thing again. On top of that, the German military was reduced. The army was allowed to be no more than 100,000 men, which we saw was really tiny compared to some of the casualties that were suffered during the First World War. The Navy was only allowed to have 12 ships. They weren't allowed to have submarines. They were not allowed to have an air force either. The idea was that the German armed capacity would be significantly reduced. Article 231 of the treaty declared that Germany was solely responsible for the outbreak of the war. That angered a lot of people in Germany. They felt that, well, for a couple of reasons. One, Germany by 1919 was a German republic, and many Germans felt that the old Kaiser regime, the old royal regime, had nothing to do with them, and they felt it essentially was wrong for the German Republic to be blamed for the crimes of the German Empire. And also many Germans felt that, okay, Germany had played a decisive role perhaps, but were outraged at the idea that Germany would be held solely responsible for the war. And so many Germans were deeply angry that their country had to pay so much. Germans talked about being enslaved for generations and trying to repay this bill. You see the cartoon here, it's actually a British cartoon, but I think it kind of reflects the idea. You have the four powers, the four leaders, so Orlando of Italy, Clemenceau of France, David Lloyd George of Britain, and Woodrow Wilson, essentially forcing the peace terms down the throat of Germany. That Germany had no choice but to accept this. Not everyone was impressed with the peace treaty. I mean, the famous economist John Keynes noted that this was trying to make punitive punishment on Germany was a bad idea. It would ensure that the peace treaty failed. The German High Commander at the end of 1918 was a guy called Ferdinand Foch. And when Foch saw the settlement, he said, "This is not a peace treaty, this is a 20-year truce." And obviously history bore out that both of those men were correct as well. So what were some of the other outcomes of the other treaties that were signed in Paris? Firstly, the Ottoman Empire was broken up. It was replaced by the independent nation-state of Turkey. And many of its colonies in the Middle East were essentially divided up between the British and French. The British and French actually decided in the middle of the war, the famous Sykes-Picot deal, to carve up the Ottoman Empire once it had been defeated. So they divided up the territories. Basically, France got Syria and Lebanon, and Britain got much of Arabia and Iraq. The British had encouraged the Arabians, the Arabs, to rebel against the Turks during the war, had promised them independence, and then kind of went back on their word and kept Arabia as their own colony. Some people argue that it's this British and French involvement in the Middle East starting in 1918 that actually has led to the Middle East to this day being a source of constant political turmoil and conflict. A whole new range of countries were formed in Eastern Europe. Firstly, Poland was restored after going missing for 130 years from Europe. The new independent state of Czechoslovakia was created. The new state of Hungary was created. And many of the old Slavic nationalities, so the Croats, the Slovenes, The Serbs, the Bosnians, were united in a new southern Slavic state that became known as Yugoslavia. The Kingdom of Yugoslavia was established. So the geography of Europe was rearranged as well, mostly out of the remnants of the old German and Austrian Empire and Russian Empire, but actually Ireland, kind of through a different process, also became independent at this time. So we have a new map of Europe in 1919 as well. The demands for reparations on the Germans and Austrians ultimately proved to be unsustainable. That the German economy goes into an enormous crisis in the 1920s, as is the Austrian economy, marked in particular by hyperinflation. That is, the price of goods increased so rapidly that essentially paper money lost all value. So at the beginning of the First World War, a German mark was the German currency, was worth about $4. By 1923, it was worth $4 trillion. A loaf of bread cost 200 billion German marks by 1923. So essentially, because the Germans basically started printing money freely in order to try and pay these costs down, which totally devalued their own currency. Considerable financial instability that led to political instability in Germany, and in some ways paved the way for the rise of the Nazis in the late 1920s. Wilson had called for a League of Nations to act as a kind of neutral arbitrator in any future disputes, essentially playing the role that the modern United Nations plays. The idea being that if all countries are members of the League of Nations, if any country attacked another nation, all the nations would rally to its defence. And Wilson hoped that this would act as a great deterrent, what he called collective security, to prevent any other future wars from breaking out. And the idea probably had a great deal of merit and was broadly popular, but there were some weaknesses in it. Both Germany and Russia, obviously two substantial European nations, were excluded. Germany were excluded because of their role in the recent war. Russia was excluded because it was communist, and the nations of Europe felt that Russia could no longer be trusted. And of course, the United States itself did not join the League of Nations. That Woodrow Wilson, when he tried to pass in the Senate, found political opposition, and ultimately the measure to join the League of Nations was defeated in the US Senate, meaning that the US kind of sat on the sidelines, which is what this cartoon is signifying here, that perhaps the key member of this breach of the League of Nations was the United States, but it did not participate in the League of Nations, which ultimately in the 1930s meant that the League of Nations was weak and unable to do much to stem the rise of aggressive powers like Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. Okay, so that's our discussion of the First World War. In our next class, we'll talk about the Russian Revolution and then try and get a better understanding of how the years following the First World War essentially laid the groundwork for the Second World War.